Hey, welcome back to Sleepy Old World. I'm so glad you're here tonight, wherever here happens to be for you. Maybe you're curled up in bed with the lights already dimmed, your phone balanced on the pillow beside you, the rest of the house gone quiet in that particular way it only does after a certain hour. Maybe you're on the couch with a blanket pulled up, or sitting somewhere small and warm while the world outside does whatever it's doing. Wherever you are, you chose to be here, and that means something to me. If tonight is your first time with us, welcome properly. Sleepy Old World is exactly what it sounds like. We come here late at night, or whenever the day needs to soften, and we step into worlds that don't exist anymore. We look at the parts of history that nobody usually bothers to paint, the ordinary parts, the private parts, the parts that happened in bedrooms and kitchens and behind closed doors when nobody thought anyone would ever be paying attention. We look at what it actually felt like to be alive in a different time, not in a palace, not on a battlefield, but in the kitchen, at the vanity, with your hands in water and your thoughts somewhere quiet. And if you've been here before, thank you. Genuinely. The fact that you keep coming back means more than I know how to say properly. Before we begin tonight, just a small and sincere ask. If what we do here feels worth your time, if this particular kind of company is something you find yourself returning to, would you take one moment and hit subscribe? And if tonight's story moves you or surprises you or makes you feel something, a like helps more than you might think. It's the sort of thing that lets this channel keep going, keeps the lamp on, keeps the door open for whoever else might wander in looking for exactly this kind of company. You can also leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love knowing someone is always watching this at 3 in the morning from a country I've never visited, and something about that feels quietly wonderful to me. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Put on a fan if you like the sound of moving air behind a voice. Find whatever position your body prefers for listening, for drifting, for that slow and lovely slide towards sleep, and let's go somewhere together. Tonight we are going to talk about hair. Specifically, we are going to talk about the act of washing it, which sounds, I know, like the least dramatic subject in the world. It sounds like something you do on a Tuesday without thinking, something that takes you 7 minutes and requires only a bottle of something that smells like coconut or eucalyptus, or whatever particular scent you've decided belongs to your clean life. But here is the thing I want you to hold as we begin. For most of the 1800s, for most of the people alive during that century, washing your hair was not a Tuesday. It was not quick. It was not simple. It was not private in the way we understand private to be. And for women in particular, it was an event layered with anxiety, ritual, social expectation, superstition, chemistry they barely understood, and a kind of physical intimacy with their own bodies that the culture around them simultaneously demanded and denied. The average woman in 1840 might wash her hair 4 times a year. 4. Not 4 times a week, not once a week, 4 times in 12 months, and she would not have thought this was strange. She would not have described herself as dirty. She would have described herself as perfectly sensible, because the logic of hair care in the 19th century was so different from ours that it operated on entirely different premises, with entirely different ingredients, in entirely different conditions, guided by entirely different fears. By the time we're done tonight, you're going to understand something that I find genuinely astonishing about that world. Not just what they did, but why it made sense to them. Not just what they put in their hair, but what they believed hair was for, what they feared it could do, what they thought it said about a woman's character and health and worth. And you're going to meet some of the ordinary women who lived inside those rituals, whose hands we can almost see when we read their letters and their diaries and the dog-eared beauty manuals they kept on their dressing tables. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with what hair actually meant in the 1800s, because you can't understand any of the rest of it without understanding that first. Picture a woman. We'll call her Margaret. She's 26 years old, living in a prosperous middle-class home in Philadelphia in the year 1852. Her husband is a clerk at a counting house downtown. She has 2 children, 3 if you count the one she lost at 8 months. She keeps a small household with the help of a girl who comes in 3 days a week to do the heavy work. Margaret's hair is brown, somewhere between chestnut and dark ash, and it reaches, when she unpins it, to the middle of her back. She has not cut it since she was a child. She will not cut it again unless illness forces the matter, and even then, she will grieve the cutting as a kind of loss she would struggle to articulate. The hair is pinned up every morning by 7. It comes down at night. Between those 2 moments, it lives in a controlled, smooth, elaborately constructed arrangement that takes her 20 minutes to achieve without help, and longer with it, depending on what the occasion demands. The hair is, in a very real sense, not just hair. It is an outward sign of inward order, a signal to everyone who sees her that she is a woman of good character, proper management, and respectable sensibility. Loose hair in public means something very specific in 1852, and none of those meanings are good ones. Hair that is untidy or dull or frizzy or wrong in any of the dozen ways it might go wrong means that something has slipped, something has failed, something in the management of the self has been allowed to fall out of control. This is not vanity in the way we use that word today, or not only vanity, it is something closer to legibility. The hair of a 19th century woman is how the world reads her, which is why washing it is so charged, because washing disrupts it. Washing takes the carefully controlled structure apart, sends it into temporary chaos, creates a window of vulnerability that is both physical and social. You cannot wash your hair and be ready in an hour the way you can now. You cannot wash it and step out of the house 5 minutes later with it still damp and looking passable. The wet hair, the drying hair, the hair in the wrong state, this is a private thing, a domestic thing, something managed with closed doors and planning and patience. And the chemicals involved, the recipes, the tools, the timing, all of it requires thought in a way that our bottled shampoo emphatically does not. Let me tell you about what hair care looked like before shampoo existed, because shampoo as we understand it, a liquid soap formulated specifically for the scalp and sold in a bottle, is a 20th century invention. The word itself is older than the product. Shampoo comes from the Hindi word champo, which means to press or massage, and it entered the English language through the British colonial presence in India, where a head massage using oil and herbs was understood as both cleansing and therapeutic. British officers brought the practice home with them in the late 1700s, and by the early 1800s, London hair salons were offering shampooing as a treatment, but it was still fundamentally a massage with oil or herbal water, not the lathering liquid rinse we know now. So what did Margaret, our Philadelphia housewife of 1852, actually use on her hair? The answer depends on what she had available, what she had been taught by her mother, what she had read in whatever household manual or ladies' magazine happened to have influenced her most, and whether she had access to certain ingredients that not everyone could afford or find. The most common approach in the early to mid-19th century was eggs. Beaten eggs, applied to the scalp and hair, then rinsed with warm water. This sounds alarming and slightly breakfast adjacent, but it was considered the standard, sensible, safe method for women who wanted clean hair without risk, and there is actually a logic to it that holds up under scrutiny. Eggs contain lecithin, which is a natural emulsifier, meaning it helps lift oil and dirt from the hair shaft without stripping the scalp of every trace of natural moisture the way strong soap would. They also contain protein, which coats the hair shaft and gives it a temporary smoothness and sheen that women of the period described as beautiful and lustrous. The method was simple in theory and fussy in practice. You would beat 1 or 2 eggs, sometimes with a little water, sometimes with a small amount of lemon juice or vinegar to help with rinsing, and you would work the mixture through your hair at the scalp, through the lengths, into every section, then rinse it out thoroughly with warm water. Not hot water, never hot water near eggs, or you would find yourself in the deeply uncomfortable position of having essentially scrambled your shampoo directly onto your hair, which required an entirely different kind of rescue effort, and was the source of genuine domestic horror stories that circulated among women who kept diaries about these things. There's a wonderful account from a woman in Connecticut, writing in 1847, who described the disaster of washing her hair with water that had been heated too enthusiastically by her kitchen girl, resulting in what she called a most deplorable situation requiring the assistance of vinegar and extreme patience before the hair could be combed out again. She wrote about it with a kind of grim humour that suggests she knew she was not the first to experience this particular calamity, and would not be the last. But eggs, for all their effectiveness, were not the only option, not even close. The 19th century was absolutely full of hair-washing recipes, some sensible, some bizarre, some that crossed the line from bizarre into genuinely alarming. Ladies' magazines, which proliferated dramatically in the mid-century, published hair care advice alongside patterns for embroidery and instructions for making preserves. Household manuals, those thick domestic encyclopedias that middle-class women were supposed to own and consult regularly, included hair-washing receipts alongside recipes for removing ink from linen and restoring a fire that had gone out. The range of what was recommended tells you a great deal about what people understood and did not understand about chemistry and cleanliness in this period. Rum was popular. Straight rum, applied to the scalp, was believed to stimulate growth, combat dryness, and clean the hair without disrupting the natural oils too aggressively. Women in the Caribbean and in British households, influenced by colonial trade, had been using it for decades before it became fashionable in mainland American beauty manuals. You would apply it with a cloth or a soft brush, work it into the scalp, let it sit for a few minutes, then wipe away the excess. The alcohol would evaporate and take with it some portion of the accumulated grease and dust. Whether this worked as advertised is debatable, but the smell was significant, which is why rum hair treatment was strictly a private domestic activity and not something you did on a Thursday afternoon before callers were expected. Rosemary infusions were used extensively. Dried rosemary steeped in boiling water, strained, cooled, and applied as a rinse, was considered both cleansing and stimulating for the scalp, good for hair that had grown dull or had been weakened by illness or anxiety. The recipe appears in practically every household manual of the period, with slight variations. Some call for adding lavender. Some specify that the water should be rainwater, not well water or river water, because rainwater was understood as softer and less likely to leave mineral deposits on the hair. Some add a small amount of cider vinegar to help close the hair cuticle after rinsing, though obviously no one in 1852 had the language of hair cuticles. What they knew, passed down through observation and shared domestic experience, was that vinegar made the hair feel smoother afterward, which it does, for reasons we now understand and they experienced without understanding. Bran was another method, and this one tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. Wheat bran, the outer husk of the grain, was made into a paste or a wash and applied to dry or dampened hair, then worked through and rinsed away. The bran was mildly absorbent, which helped lift excess oil from the scalp, and it was gentle enough to be considered appropriate for hair that was delicate or damaged. There are accounts of it being used particularly in winter, when women were reluctant to wet their hair in cold houses where the drying process could take the better part of a day and the risk of catching a chill was considered medically serious. Because that is the part we haven't talked about yet, and it is a significant part, the drying. Margaret, our Philadelphia woman, has just washed her hair. It is 9 in the morning perhaps, or later, because she would have chosen a day for this task in advance. Not a day when she was expecting visitors, not a day when she might need to leave the house, a day that was, as far as possible, free of social obligation, because her hair, from the moment it went into the water to the moment it was dry enough to pin up again, was going to be in a state of embarrassing disarray that she would not wish anyone outside the household to witness. Now the hair needs to dry. In the summer, in good weather, she might sit near an open window. In particularly warm months, she might step into the garden briefly, if the garden was private enough, the neighbours sufficiently distant, the social exposure minimal. The sun on wet hair was understood to be beneficial. Warmth hastened the drying. Fresh air was always considered healthful. But it is the middle of February, the windows are closed, the bedroom fire has been built up, because the act of washing required warmed water and a warm room, but fires do not dry hair the way we might imagine. The heat is uneven, concentrated near the hearth, dissipating quickly as you move away from it. The hair is very long, it is very thick, a single pass of warmth is not enough. So Margaret sits. She has a book, probably, or mending, or she is rehearsing a letter she needs to write in her head, and she waits. She turns her head toward the warmth. She runs a wide-toothed comb through the lengths periodically, because letting the hair dry in knots is not an option, not when you have this much of it. She uses a piece of soft linen to press gently at the roots, absorbing what moisture she can. She is patient the way that people who have no other option are patient. She is practicing a skill that every woman of her time and class possessed, without naming it as a skill, the skill of managing hair in conditions that were not designed to make managing hair easy. This process, from the initial washing to the point where the hair is dry enough to be pinned, might take 3 to 4 hours. In winter, in a cold house, longer. This is why washing your hair was an event. It was not a hygiene practice you could fold into a busy morning. It was a commitment of most of a day, and it required planning the way that any significant domestic undertaking required planning. This is also, in part, why it was done so infrequently. But before we go further into frequency and what that actually meant, I want to spend some time with something that surprises people enormously when they first encounter it, and that is the question of what happened to the hair between washings. Because if you are washing your hair 4 times a year, something has to be happening to keep it from becoming, by any reasonable standard, an absolute catastrophe. And the answer is the brush. Specifically, the boar-bristle brush, which we have visited briefly in other episodes of Sleepy Old World, but which deserves its full story here. in the context of the 1800s specifically, because this century was when brushing reached something close to its apex as a hair care practice. The 100 strokes a night that we've mentioned before was not just an old wives' tale, it was genuinely believed, genuinely practiced, and in ways that modern science has since confirmed, genuinely effective. Here is the mechanism plainly stated. Your scalp produces sebum. Sebum is a natural oil, slightly waxy in consistency, that your skin generates to protect and moisturize both the scalp and the hair shaft. In a head of hair that is washed very frequently, that oil is stripped away repeatedly, which is why people who wash daily often find they need to wash daily, because the scalp overproduces oil in response to being constantly stripped. It is a cycle of modern creating. The Victorians did not have this problem. Their scalps were not on that particular treadmill. Instead, the oil accumulated at the roots, which could make the scalp feel greasy and the hair look dull. The brush solved this. A good boar-bristle brush, with its natural keratin bristles that are in composition similar to the hair itself, would be drawn from the root through to the end of the hair shaft in long, deliberate strokes. The oil would travel with it, root to tip, over and over again. What started as grease concentrated at the scalp became, with enough brushing, a fine and even coating distributed across the entire length of the hair, giving it that particular gleam that you see in Victorian photographs and portraits, a deep, warm, almost lacquered shine that no modern dry shampoo or serum has ever quite replicated. The practice of 100 strokes was recommended in virtually every beauty manual of the century. The number varied slightly, some said 50, some said 200 for particularly long or thick hair, but 100 was the middle consensus, and it was understood as the minimum adequate maintenance for hair that was being washed rarely, not a luxury practice, the basic infrastructure of hair care. There is a piece I read in an 1869 issue of Godey's Ladies' Book, which was one of the most widely circulated women's magazines in America at the time, that describes the evening hairbrushing routine with a particularity that I find genuinely lovely. The writer instructs her readers to begin not at the roots but at the ends, working out any tangles before attempting the full stroke from root to tip, because dragging a brush through tangled hair from the top down breaks it. She recommends a count, not to make it mechanical, but to ensure adequate coverage. She notes that the hair after brushing should feel light and soft in the hand, should show a natural shine without appearing greasy. If it still appears greasy, she says, this suggests either insufficient brushing, too little time between sessions, or a constitution that produces unusually high quantities of natural oil, for which she recommends a slightly increased frequency of washing and a nightly application of dry powder to the roots. Powder. This brings us to the other great tool of the Between Washes toolkit, and one that has an absolutely fascinating history of its own. Dry powdering of the hair goes back centuries before the 1800s. Most people associate it with the elaborate white powdered wigs of the 1700s, which were indeed heavily powdered, but the practice of using powder on natural hair to absorb excess oil continued well into the 19th century, though it became less visible, more domestic, less theatrical. The powders used by ordinary women in the 1800s were generally either orris root powder, which is made from dried iris rhizome and has a faint violet-like smell that was considered pleasant, or simple cornstarch or arrowroot powder, or in the case of women who could not afford anything more particular, plain wheat flour dusted through the roots with a soft cloth or a powder puff. The application was done at the roots only, in small quantities, and then worked through with a brush or a fine-toothed comb to distribute it and prevent any visible white residue. Done well, dry powdering could extend the interval between washings quite significantly. It absorbed the oil that accumulated at the scalp, gave the hair volume that naturally oily hair tended to lack, and left behind the faint pleasant smell of whatever fragrance had been added to the powder. Many women made their own powders at home, mixing the base of orris or starch with a small amount of dried lavender or rose petals or cloves. The dry powder method is, if you look at it honestly, essentially the 19th century version of modern dry shampoo. The concept is exactly the same. The delivery mechanism is different, the ingredients are different, but the underlying logic is identical, and it worked then the way it works now. What makes the 1800s interesting is that this was also the century in which attitudes toward washing began to shift, not uniformly, not everywhere, not all at once, but visibly, measurably, as a consequence of several things happening simultaneously. The germ theory of disease was developing. It was not yet proven, not yet accepted across the medical establishment, but by the 1860s and 1870s, the ideas of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were beginning to circulate, and the concept that illness could be transmitted through invisible particles, through contact with contaminated matter, through the residue of bodies that had been sick, was slowly, haltingly beginning to change what cleanliness meant. Public health reform was underway in cities that had been devastated by cholera, by typhoid, by the various epidemic diseases that thrived in crowded, unsanitary urban conditions. The connection between filth and disease was being established, at least in its broadest outlines, and this connection, once made, began to expand outward from the obvious targets, the cesspools and the contaminated wells, and reach into the domestic sphere, into the question of how clean bodies needed to be. At the same time, new technologies were making water more available, running water in homes, bathroom fixtures that allowed for indoor bathing without the labor-intensive process of filling and emptying a tub by hand, hot water from a geyser or boiler rather than from a kettle on the stove. These changes happened slowly and unevenly, first in wealthy urban homes, then spreading outward over decades, but they changed what was physically possible, and the beauty industry was growing. The mid-century proliferation of ladies' magazines and household manuals was accompanied by a corresponding growth in products that could be purchased rather than made at home. Pomades, oils, hair tonics, hair washes marketed under various hopeful names. The commercial grooming industry was beginning to understand that it could sell women not just ingredients but results, not just recipes but ready-made solutions. So across the 1800s, there is a slow and complicated trajectory from hair that was washed very rarely, managed between washings through brushing and powdering and oiling, and understood as naturally healthy if left largely alone, toward hair that was washed more frequently, managed with an increasing variety of commercial products, and understood through a slightly different lens where visible cleanliness was becoming more important as a marker of respectability. But it was not a straight line, not even close. And the experiences of real women across this century are far more various, far more interesting, and far messier than any single narrative would suggest. Let me take you to a different woman now, further from Margaret's comfortable Philadelphia house, further from the world of ladies' magazines and household manuals. Her name is Ellen. She's 31 years old in 1858, living in a two-room house on the outskirts of a small town in rural Kentucky with her husband and 4 children, the oldest 9 and the youngest still nursing. Her husband farms a modest piece of land. They are not poor exactly, but they are close to the edge of not poor, in the way that most rural families of this period were, which is to say that there is no margin for unnecessary expenditure, no money for orris root powder or rosemary from a chemist's shop, and no leisure time for the long, careful hair-washing mornings that Margaret could arrange for herself. Ellen's hair is dark brown and straight, and she wears it braided and wound at the back of her head, and she has been wearing it this way since she was 15. Her hair is not washed frequently. She has no hot water to spare in the easy way, because every drop of hot water requires wood to heat it and time to tend the fire. She has no quiet weekday morning to devote to drying it slowly in a warm room, because the quiet weekday mornings of her life are not quiet, are not devoted to anything less than the immediate physical demands of 4 children and a farm household that requires her labor from first light. What Ellen does is different from what Margaret does, but it is not less considered. She has been taught by her mother, who was taught by hers, and the knowledge is practical and specific and earned through trial over generations. She uses rendered bear fat, or lard if bear fat is not available, worked through the hair in very small quantities to control the surface, to keep the hair from drying and breaking, to keep the braiding smooth. She combs it every morning with a horn comb that has been in the family for 15 years. She washes it, when she washes it, with rainwater collected in the barrel at the corner of the house, which is softer than the well water and will not leave mineral deposits. She makes a rinse from vinegar and the dried chamomile that she grows herself, which makes her hair smell clean in a way that the lard alone does not quite accomplish. She has read nothing about hair care. She has never seen a ladies' magazine. She could not tell you what orris root is. But she knows her hair the way she knows her kitchen, from long intimate familiarity, from knowing what happens when you do one thing versus another, from the kind of expertise that comes not from formal knowledge, but from paying close attention to the actual texture of your actual life. There is a diary that survives from a woman named Hannah Luttrell, written in central Ohio between 1849 and 1867. It is not a famous diary. It is preserved in a small historical society archive in a town that barely appears on modern maps. Hannah was a farm wife, married to a man who ran a grain mill, with 5 children who all reached adulthood, which was not a given in Ohio in 1849. Her diary is mostly about weather, about crops, about the health of animals, about the small social world of her county. but interspersed throughout it are tiny, specific domestic details that I find extraordinary. On a Saturday in April of 1853, she writes simply that she washed her hair in the morning and spent the afternoon in front of the kitchen window with her combing. That phrase, her combing, is wonderful. The idea that the combing out of washed hair was such a regular and defined activity that it had its own shorthand name. She had a particular comb for it, a wide-toothed one she describes elsewhere as her good comb, and she would sit for an hour or more working through the hair systematically before the fire. On a different day in the winter of 1857, she mentions that her eldest daughter, who would have been about 14 at the time, had gotten her hair into such a tangle from sleeping without braiding it, that it had taken two of them the better part of the morning to sort it out, and she does not sound pleased. The hair of a child who hadn't braided it properly before bed, creating the kind of matted chaos that took hours to undo, was apparently a real and specific domestic ordeal with which she had intimate experience. These small moments in Hannah's diary give me something that the formal historical record often lacks, which is the texture of how hair was actually experienced by actual women going about their actual days, not as an abstract beauty practice, not as a social signal, but as a physical thing that required management and attention and sometimes caused genuine problems and had to be dealt with practically and without sentiment. Now, let me tell you about the full and specific process of washing hair in the mid-19th century, because I want you to feel it, not just know about it. I want you to be in the room. I want you to understand the scale of the undertaking, the preparation it required, the sensory experience of it, the things that could go wrong, and the things that, when they went right, were probably rather wonderful. It is a Wednesday morning in the early spring of 1855. Margaret has decided that today is the day. She has arranged her schedule. Her mother-in-law, who usually calls on Wednesdays, has been gently redirected by a note. Her kitchen girl has been instructed to have warm water ready and to keep the children occupied. The bedroom fire has been built up since 7. The room is warm as it is going to get. The preparation of the water itself is a non-trivial undertaking. Hard water, the water from most wells and many urban pipes, is full of dissolved minerals, primarily calcium and magnesium compounds, that make it difficult to rinse soap or any alkaline substance from the hair without leaving residue. This residue is what makes hair feel stiff and dull after washing in hard water. The women of this period knew this empirically without knowing the chemistry. They knew it because they had tried washing their hair in well water and felt the result, and then tried it in collected rainwater and felt the difference. So Margaret uses rainwater when she can get it, collected in a barrel in the yard. She has had this barrel for years. She stores it covered, decants from it carefully. If the rainwater barrel is low, she might use water that has had a small amount of borax dissolved into it, because borax softens hard water by precipitating the calcium out of solution, and while she does not know that is what it does, she knows that water treated with a little borax rinses more cleanly, the way that women have always known the results of things before they knew the reasons. She heats the water carefully in 2 large kettles, then pours it into the washing bowl, testing the temperature with her wrist, the way she'd test it for a baby's bath. Too hot will strip the scalp and cause the sebum to overproduce. Too cold is uncomfortable and ineffective. She is aiming for something pleasantly warm, something you could put your face into without flinching. She has prepared her washing mixture the day before. This is her own particular recipe, inherited in broad outline from her mother and modified over the years through her own observation. She has beaten 2 eggs with a small amount of rosewater from the apothecary, added a tablespoon of good brandy, which serves as a light astringent, and mixed in a few drops of oil of rosemary. The mixture smells quite nice, actually. Rich and botanical and slightly alcoholic. She keeps it covered in a small pottery bowl on her dressing table. She unpins her hair. This takes a few minutes because there are a great many pins, and they need to be removed systematically so she can find them all again later. The pins go into a small china dish with a lid. 24 pins this morning, a usual number. The hair falls down. It reaches to just below her shoulder blades when it's down, which is not exceptional for a woman of this period and her social class. She takes her wide-toothed comb and works through it first, from end to root, the way her mother taught her, because working a comb through tangled hair from the top is how you break it, and broken hair that has taken years to grow is not breakage you absorb lightly. She leans over the wash bowl. The warm water rises to meet her face. The first contact of wet hands with her scalp is slightly shocking, even though she knew it was coming. She works the egg mixture through the hair at the roots, section by section, parting with her fingers, pressing the mixture against the scalp, massaging in small circles. The circulation this produces is pleasant. Her scalp has been under tight pinning for months, in the way that Margaret's life is organized around propriety, and the release of that, and the warmth of the water combined, is a small physical luxury. She works the mixture through the lengths. The egg begins to foam slightly, not the rich lather of modern shampoo, nothing like that, more of a thin, slippery coating that she distributes as evenly as she can. She adds more water from the second pitcher to rinse, bending further over the bowl, working her fingers through from root to tip repeatedly to coax the cleaning mixture out. The water that runs off her hair is slightly clouded. She pours it away and uses fresh water, cooler now, for a final rinse. The vinegar rinse comes next. A small amount of apple cider vinegar in a pitcher of cool water, poured slowly over the full length of the hair, worked through with her fingers. The smell is briefly sharp, and she makes a small involuntary face at it, but she knows what it does. The hair afterward, when it dries, will be smoother, the surface of each strand more aligned, less likely to tangle into chaos during the hours of drying. The vinegar smell will fade as the hair dries. She knows this from experience. She wraps her hair in a linen towel, not squeezing it the way we might squeeze a wet towel around our hair, but pressing and patting, because rough treatment of wet hair breaks it. She knows this too. She ties the towel loosely on her head and sits down by the bedroom fire with her comb and her patience. Over the next 2 hours, the hair will dry. She will spend a good part of that time working the wide-toothed comb through it periodically, preventing tangles, encouraging the strands to dry separately rather than knotted together. She will turn toward the fire and then away from it, managing the heat to avoid drying the hair unevenly. She will think. She will read a few pages of the novel on her nightstand and then set it down again. She will listen to the sounds of the house below her, the children somewhere with the kitchen girl, the street outside, a cart going past, a dog barking once, and then giving up. When the hair is dry enough to be safe, she will take up her boar-bristle brush and begin the long, careful process of brushing it out. The movement is rhythmic and a little hypnotic. She brushes until the hair is smooth and gleaming, and she can feel it respond differently under the brush than it did before, lighter, softer, somehow more alive than the pinned-up version that everyone else sees. Then she pins it back up, and the morning is gone, but the hair is clean, and it will be clean for weeks, managed between now and the next washing with brushing and a little powder at the roots when needed, and it will hold. This, in its full practical and sensory detail, is what hair care looked like for a woman like Margaret in the middle of the 19th century. It was not a beauty routine in the quick, consumable modern sense. It was more like the kind of maintenance you give to something precious and irreplaceable, something you understand will require extended care, but that repays the attention in a way that casual neglect never would. I want to stay with this question of frequency for a bit longer, because it is the thing people find most startling when they first encounter it, and the thing that most requires some genuine context to make sense of. 4 times a year is the figure most often cited for the average washing frequency of a middle-class woman's hair in the first half of the 19th century. Some women washed more often than that. Some women, in specific circumstances, washed considerably less. The figure is an average drawn from diary records, letters, and household accounts, and it represents the central tendency of a very wide range. But what does 4 times a year actually mean in terms of lived experience? What did the hair actually feel like in between? And why didn't the women who maintained this schedule experience it as a problem? The answer, at its core, is the sebum, the natural oil, the thing that brushing distributes and powdering absorbs, and that the whole between washes management system is designed to keep in balance. When you wash your hair rarely, and when you have been managing it with daily brushing throughout the interval, the sebum distribution across the hair shaft creates a certain kind of condition that is genuinely different from the experience of hair that is washed frequently. It is smoother in some ways, more resistant to damage. The outermost layer of each hair shaft, the cuticle, which is where the microscopic scales are that determine whether hair looks glossy or dull, is not stripped and then coated with conditioner, stripped and then coated, over and over in the modern cycle. It is simply maintained with its own natural coating, and the natural coating, evenly distributed, is not nothing. It is actually quite effective. Women who have done extended experiments with very infrequent washing today, and there is a small but genuine community of people who have tried it, often report that the hair goes through an adjustment period of several weeks during which it does feel genuinely greasy, and then it stabilizes into something that is manageable, and by their accounts, actually healthier looking than it was before. The scalp recalibrates. The oil production settles, the system finds its equilibrium. The women of the 1800s did not go through an adjustment period because they had never started the frequent washing cycle in the first place. Their scalps were operating at a different baseline. The management system they had inherited from their mothers and grandmothers was designed around that baseline, and it worked. This is not to say that everything was perfect and that Victorian hair was a paradise of health and glossiness. There were real problems. There were persistent issues that we now understand differently than they understood them. Lice, to state the obvious plainly, were a real and recurring challenge. Head lice thrive where hair is rarely washed and where multiple people in close proximity share space and bedding and combs. The 19th century, particularly for poorer families in crowded urban conditions, was not great for this problem. The louse comb, a fine-toothed metal comb designed for removing lice and their eggs from the hair, was a standard household item. Not because everyone used it constantly, but because everyone knew they might need it. The 100 strokes of the brush we've discussed had, as we mentioned in an earlier episode, an ancillary effect of dislodging some nits with each pass, which was not its primary purpose, but was not an unwelcome consequence. The management of lice, when they were found, was aggressive by our standards. Kerosene was a common treatment in the latter part of the century. You applied it to the scalp, wrapped the head tightly, waited for an extended period, then washed it out with soap. It was effective. It was also flammable, and not particularly kind to the scalp. There were various herbal preparations used before kerosene became widely available: pennyroyal oil, tansy, neem bark in regions where it was available, some of which had genuine insecticidal properties, and some of which were primarily wishful thinking. Dandruff was understood but not well managed. It was attributed in various 19th century beauty manuals to a range of causes: excessive heat, improper diet, the use of inferior pomades, insufficient brushing, constitutional weakness. The actual cause, a particular yeast called Malassea that lives on the scalp and can cause flaking when it proliferates, was not identified until much later. The treatments offered, various tonic rinses, increased brushing, changes in diet, were only intermittently effective because they were aimed at the wrong target. Hair loss was a significant preoccupation. The Victorian period was the golden age of hair tonics, products marketed under elaborate names with elaborate claims promising to halt hair loss, restore lost hair, stimulate dormant follicles, and transform the thin and unfortunate into the thick and enviable. Many of these tonics were essentially useless. Some contained genuinely dangerous ingredients. A few, by accident more than design, contained compounds that actually did something to the scalp, castor oil and certain herbal astringents being perhaps the most legitimate. One of the most popular hair tonics in mid-century America was bay rum, made from the distillation of bayberry leaves in rum or another alcohol base, and it was sold commercially in druggist shops from at least the 1850s onward. Bay rum genuinely does have mild antiseptic properties, genuinely does give the scalp a pleasant warming sensation, and genuinely does smell better than most of the other options on offer. Whether it stimulated hair growth is more doubtful, but the combination of pleasant smell, invigorating sensation, and professional packaging in a nice bottle meant that it sold extremely well and remained popular well into the 20th century. There is something I find genuinely moving about the lengths to which people went in this century to care for their hair with limited resources and limited understanding. The elaborate preparations, the careful timing, the recipes passed from mother to daughter with the seriousness of inheritance. All of it adds up to a picture of people who understood that their hair mattered, even if the reasons they believed it mattered were sometimes different from the reasons we would give. Because for women in the 19th century, and I want to say this plainly without turning it into a lecture, hair was power in a way that is difficult to fully communicate to a 21st century reader. Not power in the abstract feminist sense, though there is that dimension too. Power in the immediate, social, practical sense, that your appearance was your primary form of currency in the public world, and your hair was the most visible and variable element of that appearance. The woman with beautiful hair was noticed. She was remembered. She was considered to have something. The association between long, healthy, well-managed hair and feminine virtue was so deep in 19th century culture that it functioned almost like a law. Women who cut their hair were making a statement that could be read as eccentric at best and improper at worst. Women whose hair was disordered were women whose character was in question. The hair at the same time was deeply private. The pinned-up, controlled version was the public one. The unpinned, loose, brushed-out version was strictly domestic, seen only by the woman herself, her husband if she had one, her daughters, her personal maid if she had that kind of household. There are accounts, particularly from advice literature and from novels of the period, of the loosening of the hair as an intimate act, as a kind of threshold crossing between the public self and the private one. Reads now, this is why hair washing in particular had such a charged domestic character. It was the fullest undoing of the public arrangement. The hair wet and loose and cooling, and not yet under control, was a vulnerable state, and vulnerabilities in the 19th century were carefully managed. Now let me tell you about the specific tools that a well-equipped woman of this period would have had on her dressing table, because the material culture of hair care is fascinating in its own right and tells you a great deal about the values and economics of the era. The brush came first. The best brushes of the period were backed in ivory or tortoiseshell, with bristles from the boar, and they were expensive. An ivory-backed hairbrush in the 1850s might cost the equivalent of several days' wages for a domestic servant. They were bought with intention, used for decades, repaired when the backing cracked or the bristles thinned. A good brush was something you gave as a gift at a wedding or a significant birthday. It was an investment in the ongoing project of the hair. Less expensive brushes were backed in horn or wood, with bristles of similar quality. Working-class women who kept brushes at all would have these. The very poor, or very young, or those in circumstances that allowed for no surplus expenditure, might use a comb only, or share a brush with family members. The comb, the wide-toothed comb for detangling, the fine-toothed comb for general grooming, and the fine-toothed metal louse comb for the purpose its name describes. The good combs were made of horn or tortoiseshell, which had a slight flexibility that made them less likely to snap when drawn through resistant hair. Combs of this material were also considered gentler on the hair shaft than combs of harder materials. Celluloid combs began to appear later in the century, from the 1870s onward, as celluloid became one of the first widely used synthetic materials, and these were cheaper and more durable, though they had the disadvantage of being flammable, which was more than a theoretical concern in an era of gaslighting and open flames. The pomade jar. Pomade, a greased preparation for smoothing and dressing the hair, was present on virtually every Victorian dressing table in some form. It ranged from the sophisticated and expensive scented preparations from London perfumers packaged in elegant pottery jars with printed paper labels, to the entirely homemade lard or tallow with a little beeswax melted in and perhaps some drops of lavender or cloves for fragrance. The function was the same regardless of the packaging: to provide enough lubrication to smooth the hair into its desired style, to control the flyaway strands that would otherwise escape the pins, and to give the surface of the dressed hair that smooth, finished appearance that separated the carefully tended from the casually managed. The pomade was applied in very small amounts, worked through the palms, and then drawn lightly over the surface of the hair after it was dressed. Too much, and the hair looked greasy and was worse, became sticky and attracted dust from the environment. Too little, and there was no effect. The calibration of the right amount was part of the body knowledge of the women who used it, the kind of thing you learn by doing it wrong several times and adjusting. The hair receiver. This is one of the Victorian dressing table objects that modern people, when they encounter it in antique shops or museum collections, often find puzzling. It is a small covered jar, usually matching the powder box and the pin dish on the dressing table, and its purpose is to collect the hair that comes out during combing and brushing. Because Victorian women saved their shedded hair deliberately, systematically. There were several reasons for this, and they reveal something important about how hair was understood in the culture of the period. First, the hair thus collected could be used in various forms of hair work, the making of jewelry and decorative objects from human hair that was one of the distinctive art forms and memento practices of the Victorian era. We will come to this in some detail. Second, the amount of hair collected each day could be observed as an indicator of health. A woman who was shedding noticeably more than usual was alert to this as a possible sign of illness, nutritional deficit, or excessive nervous strain, all of which were understood to manifest in the hair. Third, and perhaps most prosaically, collected hair could be used to pad and supplement the elaborate coiffures of the period, because Victorian hairstyles required a volume of hair that many women did not naturally possess. This third reason is worth exploring, because it connects to something in the history of hair care that is often overlooked, which is the gap between what hair was supposed to look like and what it actually looked like, and what women did to bridge that gap. The ideal head of hair in the mid to late 19th century was thick, full, and abundant. The hairstyles of the period, the elaborate upsweeps and braided chignons and high-piled constructions of the 1860s and 1870s, the more extreme arrangements of the 1880s, all required a great deal of hair. More hair, frankly, than many women naturally had. The solution was supplementation. Hair pieces, switches, chignons of false hair, braid additions, pads made from the saved and cleaned combings of the woman's own hair, these were all in common use. This was not considered deceptive, exactly, or not more deceptive than the padding in a fashionable sleeve or the stays in a fashionable bodice. The idealized female form of the period was constructed rather than found, and the hair was part of the construction. The switches and chignons sold commercially were made from human hair, and there was a real and significant industry in the collection and sale of human hair throughout the 19th century. Young women in rural areas, particularly in France and Eastern Europe, would sell their hair when it was cut, and it would travel through various processing stages to eventually become part of the elaborate coiffure of a middle-class English or American woman who would never know whose head it had come from. There is something in this chain, the poor country girl's hair on the head of the prosperous city woman, that the Victorians themselves occasionally noted with a complicated mix of practicality and unease. There are letters from women of the period who express a certain queasy awareness of what they are wearing and a kind of gratitude that they don't know more about it. The hair that women saved in their hair receivers, their own combings cleaned and worked into a small pad, was used in a more intimate way, a supplementation that was literally of themselves, their own hair returned to their own head in a slightly different form. This felt different, and women who wrote about it described a kind of comfort in the circularity of it. Now I want to talk about hair oil, because the use of oil on the hair is something that the 19th century approached with a very different cultural calculus than we do now, and the evolution of that approach across the century tells a story of its own. For most of the first half of the century, oiling the hair was a normal and unremarkable practice. Women of all classes used some form of oil or pomade on their hair regularly, not to make it greasy, but to maintain it, to prevent the ends from splitting and drying, to keep the hair shaft smooth and manageable. The particular oils used varied by what was available. Olive oil was widespread and affordable in Mediterranean regions and was imported in large quantities to Northern Europe and America. Castor oil, thick and heavy, was used in small amounts and considered particularly good for the scalp. Coconut oil, which requires a warm climate to remain liquid and was thus less common in colder regions, was used extensively in parts of Asia and Africa, where it was locally produced, and began appearing in commercial hair preparations sold in Britain and America from the mid-century onward. Bear fat, which we met already on Ellen's dressing table in Kentucky, was used throughout North America in regions where bear hunting was common. It was rendered from the fat layer of the animal, which is considerable, purified by melting, straining and remelting, then stored in sealed jars. It was considered to have particular virtues for the hair, to be especially nourishing, and its reputation was partly cultural, carried in from the indigenous practices of communities who had been using it for generations, partly practical, because it is indeed a good emollient that absorbs into the skin without leaving excessive grease, if applied in small quantities. The commercial hair oil industry was already underway by the 1820s and 1830s. Macassar oil was the fashionable hair oil of the early Victorian period, an import from the Macassar region of what is now Sulawesi in Indonesia, made from a blend of palm and ilipi nut oils. It was sold under various brand names in England from the 1820s onward, heavily marketed as an improvement on domestic animal fat preparations, and it became so widely used, so ubiquitous on the heads of fashionable men and women, that it prompted the invention of the antimacassar, those small crocheted or embroidered cloths that Victorian housewives placed on the backs and arms of upholstered chairs to protect the fabric from the oil that rubbed off users' hair. The antimacassar. I love that this word has its meaning directly in someone's hair oil, that the precaution taken against the oil staining the furniture became more famous than the oil itself, more remembered, more domestically visible. There is something characteristically Victorian about that, the management system outlasting the thing it was managing. By mid-century, and this is where things get genuinely interesting, there was a growing body of opinion that too much oil on the hair was problematic. Not from any evidence-based health perspective, at least not initially, but from an increasingly aesthetic one. The very heavily oiled hair of the fashionable man of 1825, the gleaming and almost lacquered surface produced by liberal application of macassar, began to look a little excessive, a little try-hard, a little much, to the eyes of the later century. The fashion shifted toward hair that looked naturally healthy rather than artificially shiny, which in practice meant less oil applied more discreetly. The discourse around women's hair was slightly different because women's hair was understood to have a different relationship to oil than men's. Women's hair, being longer and thus more prone to dry ends and split tips, was thought to require more oil for maintenance purposes, but the oil had to be applied correctly, in very small amounts, worked through the lengths, and never so much that the hair appeared greasy or heavy. The line between nourished and overdone was fine, and was policed by the beauty press with enthusiasm. There are wonderful passages in mid-Victorian ladies' magazines on the subject of the right amount of oil in the hair, none of them precisely quantitative, all of them deeply concerned with the appearance of naturalness. The hair should look as if it had not been dressed at all, one 1861 beauty writer advises, by which she means as if it had not had products applied to it, though in the same paragraph she recommends applying a small amount of good pomatum before pinning. The doubleness in that instruction, aim for the natural look through careful artifice, is so perfectly Victorian that it might as well be a motto. Let me take you now to the question of hair in illness, because this is a dimension of the 19th century relationship to hair that I find particularly affecting and that doesn't often get the attention it deserves. When a woman in the 1800s fell seriously ill, the care of her hair became a distinct and important concern, both practically and symbolically. Long hair tangled and matted during illness in ways that were painful to undo. If a woman was bedridden for weeks, which was common in an era when conditions like typhoid fever, tuberculosis, puerperal fever, and serious infections routinely confined patients for extended periods, the hair became a management problem of real proportion. The standard practice was to braid the hair in 2 loose plaits during illness, one on each side, to prevent the worst matting. The hair would be gently combed each day if the patient could tolerate it, not thoroughly, not with the full 100-stroke brush treatment, but a gentle pass-through with the comb to prevent the worst knots from setting in permanently. Women who served as nurses, whether professional, in the sense that nursing was beginning to professionalize in the latter part of the century, or domestic, in the sense of the female relative who took charge of sick rooms, were expected to know how to manage a patient's hair. Florence Nightingale, in her famous Notes on Nursing published in 1859, includes specific instructions on the care of a patient's hair that reveal how seriously the matter was taken. She writes that the hair of a patient who has been allowed to become matted and entangled during illness is a cause of unnecessary suffering and is a failure of proper nursing care. She prescribes daily combing and braiding as a basic element of good patient management, arguing that cleanliness and order in the patient's appearance have direct effects on their sense of well-being and thus on their recovery. Nightingale understood something that we sometimes lose in our clinical modern context, which is that the body's felt experience of itself, the comfort or discomfort of skin and hair and the physical surface of a person, has real effects on morale and on the mysterious processes of recovery. The woman lying in a sickbed with matted hair was suffering an additional discomfort on top of her illness. The woman whose hair had been gently tended and braided by competent hands was, in a small but real way, better cared for. When women died in the 19th century, as they died of childbirth and of tuberculosis and of typhoid and of the 100 other things that claimed them, with a frequency that we struggle now to really feel in our bones, their hair was a significant part of what was done with their remains. Hair was cut from the dead and saved. It was kept in lockets, woven into memorial brooches, braided into rings and bracelets, pressed into the pages of books and Bibles, preserved with a care that suggests how intensely the hair was understood as a continuation of the person. The hair does not decay the way other parts of the body decay. It persists. It carries DNA, as we now know, though they did not. What they knew was that the hair felt alive in a way that other remnants did not, that it felt like a piece of the person still present in the world. Hair mourning jewellery is one of the most distinctive art forms of the Victorian period. There are museums that have collections of it, and if you have ever seen one, you know that the effect is deeply strange. A tiny braided bracelet made from hair that could be 150 years old, a pendant under a glass dome with an intricate painted scene in which every element, the trees, the ground, the framing details, is made from human hair arranged in miniature. A ring with a small compartment that opens to reveal a lock. These objects were made with great skill and great care. There were professional hair workers in Victorian cities who specialized in this work, and there were also pattern books that women could buy to learn the braiding and weaving techniques themselves at home, turning the preserved hair of their loved ones into something that could be worn and touched and looked at, rather than simply kept in a box. The hair thus preserved was often the hair that had been tended and cared for over a lifetime. The hair that had been brushed 100 strokes a night, washed 4 times a year with egg and rose water and vinegar, pinned up and taken down, and pinned up again across decades. There is something in that continuity, from the living hair to the mourning jewel, that tells you a great deal about how intensely these women understood their hair as part of themselves, not an accessory but an extension of the self. And now let me step forward in time a little, into the latter part of the 19th century, because this is where the story of hair washing in the 1800s becomes genuinely complicated, where the old practices begin to be challenged, where commercial products begin to enter in significant ways, and where you can actually watch a shift in cultural understanding happening in real time through the evidence of beauty writing and personal correspondence. By the 1870s and 1880s, the washing frequency was beginning to creep upward for women in urban areas, with access to running water and with enough leisure time to manage more frequent washings. 2 times a year became 4 became 6 or 8 for some. Monthly washings were being discussed in ladies' magazines as a reasonable aspiration rather than an eccentric extreme. The reasons were several and interacting. The germ theory, as it penetrated popular consciousness, was changing the meaning of visible cleanliness. Dirt was no longer just aesthetically undesirable, it was potentially dangerous, potentially the medium through which invisible disease spread. Clean hair, in this new framing, was not just beautiful, it was safe. This reframing gave women who wanted to wash their hair more often both a reason and a cultural permission that had not quite existed before. The development of indoor plumbing in middle-class urban homes made the practical logistics of hair washing significantly easier. A bathroom with a fixed tub and a supply of hot water eliminated the labor of carrying and heating water that had been a significant barrier. You could arrange yourself over the tub, use the running water to rinse, and dispense with most of the complicated bowl and pitcher setup that had governed earlier washings. The process did not become quick, not yet. Hair still had to dry, and there were still no electric dryers, but it became less elaborate in its preparation, and the commercial product market was expanding. By the 1880s and 1890s, liquid shampoo preparations, still quite different from what we know now but moving in that direction, were beginning to appear in druggists' shops and in the back pages of ladies' magazines. These products were typically made of soap dissolved in water with various herbal additives, rose water, glycerin, sometimes egg white, sold in small bottles with printed labels that made claims ranging from the modest to the spectacular. Berger's Glycerin Jelly Shampoo, Canthrox Shampoo, the Edwin Burt Hair Tonic. The names had a certain dignity to them, a commercial seriousness, that distinguished them from the household recipes they were gradually beginning to replace. The move from making your own hair wash at home from ingredients you understood and had tested, to buying a bottled product whose ingredients you did not know and whose claims you were taking on faith, was not a trivial shift. It represented a change in the relationship between women and the care of their bodies, a move from self-sufficiency and embodied knowledge toward dependence on the expertise of manufacturers who often had more commercial interest in their products than strictly health-based ones. This shift had already happened in some areas of domestic life. Women had been buying commercially made soap for decades rather than making it at home. Commercially made candles had replaced tallow dipping in most households by mid-century. The principle of purchasing rather than producing was not new, but when it extended to the care of the body itself, it brought with it a particular vulnerability, the vulnerability of not knowing what you were putting on yourself and having to rely on the word of someone who was trying to sell you something. Some of the products sold in this period were genuinely effective in limited ways. Some were simply the household recipes of egg and vinegar in a new commercial format, and some were something else entirely, preparations that contained ingredients that were not benign and that were marketed with a confidence that their ingredients in no way supported. Lead acetate. You've heard us mention lead in other episodes in the context of cosmetics and hair dye. Its presence in the history of Victorian hair care is grim and real. Lead acetate, sometimes called sugar of lead, was used as a darkening agent in hair dyes for much of the 19th century. It reacts with the sulfur compounds in the hair shaft to produce a gradual darkening effect, which made it useful for covering grey hair or darkening hair that was lighter than fashionable. It was sold under various names, mixed into preparations with innocuous-sounding names, and used by women who had no idea that they were applying a lead compound to their scalps repeatedly over years. Lead accumulates in the body. It does not pass through and leave. Each application added to the total load. The effects of chronic low-level lead exposure are neurological, as we now know clearly, irritability, cognitive changes, weakness, and over long periods, and at high doses, serious damage to the kidneys and the nervous system. These symptoms, when they appeared in women who used lead-based hair dyes regularly, were attributed by contemporary physicians to any number of other causes. The hair dye was not the obvious suspect because lead was simply not understood the way we now understand it. The use of lead in hair dye continued, in some products and some markets, well past the point when the medical evidence against it was quite clear because the commercial interests involved were significant and regulation was minimal. The women who used these products, seeking to maintain the appearance of their natural hair color or to cover the gray that advancing age had brought, were harmed by their hair care in ways they never knew. Arsenic is another presence in this story that cannot be avoided. Arsenic-based compounds were used in various beauty preparations of the period, as we've mentioned in our Victorian skincare episode, and the hair care products of the latter 19th century were not immune to this. There were preparations sold as scalp tonics that contained small amounts of arsenic, justified by the belief that arsenic in small doses was a tonic for the system and would stimulate hair growth and health. This belief was not entirely baseless in the specific sense that arsenic does have some effects on the body that could in very limited circumstances be interpreted as beneficial, but the margin between a supposedly tonic dose and a harmful one was narrow and poorly understood, and the chronic accumulation of even small exposures was damaging in ways that were not recognized. I want to be careful here not to make the 19th century sound uniformly dangerous, because that would not be accurate either. The vast majority of hair care practices of the period were harmless or mildly beneficial. The egg washes, the vinegar rinses, the rosemary water, the brushing. The dangerous practices were more common in specific areas, particularly in hair dye and hair growth preparations, and they were more common in commercial products than in homemade ones, because the commercial manufacturer had more to conceal and more incentive to include whatever ingredient would make the most dramatic claimed effect. The women doing their hair care at home with their own recipes and their own hands were, on balance, safer than the women placing their trust in the expanding commercial grooming market, which is a kind of irony that runs through the whole 19th century relationship to modernization and product culture more broadly. Let me take you now to the specific world of the hair salon, or what passed for it in the 1800s, because this is another dimension of the history that reveals a great deal about class, about gender, and about the very specific social geography of hair. For most of the century, for most women, the management of the hair was entirely domestic. It happened in the bedroom, at the dressing table, with the assistance of a maid if you had one, or entirely alone if you did not. Going out to have your hair professionally done was not a practice available to ordinary women. It was a practice of the very wealthy, and even for them it was occasional rather than routine. There were professional hairdressers in 19th century cities, usually men, who worked from shops, and who also made house calls for the dressing of hair before significant occasions. The fashion plates of the period show elaborate hairstyles that would have required professional assistance or extraordinary patience and skill to create at home, and some of the women who wore these styles did employ hairdressers to create them for significant events. But the professional hairdresser of this period was primarily a dresser, not a washer. The actual cleansing of the hair was a domestic act. It happened at home, in private, before the professional arrived, if professional assistance was involved at all. The idea of going out to a salon specifically to have your hair washed was not part of the 19th century vocabulary. This began to change toward the very end of the century as hair washing became more frequent and as the commercial shampoo industry began to make inroads. By the 1890s, some hairdressing establishments in larger cities were advertising shampoo treatments as part of their service, performed on a reclining chair with the client's head over a basin, a setup that was more or less recognizable as the precursor of the modern salon shampoo. But this was new, urban, upper middle class, and relatively uncommon. Most women were still washing their own hair, in their own homes, by their own methods, at the end of the 19th century, just as they had been at its beginning. The gap between the experience of the wealthy urban woman and the rural or working-class woman widened in some ways across the century, even as it narrowed in others. The urban professional class woman by 1890 might have hot running water in her bathroom, access to commercial shampoo preparations, and the option of a professional treatment if she wished it. The rural farm wife in the same year was still using her rain barrel and her egg mixture and her patience, the same fundamental approach that had been in use for generations. This is not to say that the farm wife's approach was inferior. In some respects it was more grounded in real knowledge and less subject to the manipulations of commercial interest. But the divergence of experience is worth noting because the story of hair care in the 19th century is not one story. It is many, shaped by geography and class and access and circumstance, and any single account of it will necessarily leave most of those stories untold. Let me tell you about hair color and its management in the 1800s, because this too is a significant piece of the story that connects to washing and overall care in complicated ways. The natural hair of the women of the period ranged in colour through the full human spectrum, but the fashionable ideal shifted across the decades and was not uniform across the century. In the early Victorian period, dark hair, particularly dark brown and black, was considered romantic and beautiful, associated with the Byronic and Gothic aesthetic currents of the era. By mid-century, the aesthetic had broadened, and there was more visible celebration of various natural colours. By the latter part of the century, the pre-Raphaelite movement in art had made red and auburn hair genuinely fashionable, sometimes enviable, in a way that was quite new for a hair colour that had historically been associated with negative characteristics in European cultural traditions. The management of hair colour in this period was partly about preserving the natural colour and partly about altering it when the natural colour was considered either unfashionable or insufficiently attractive. The preservation of natural colour was connected to the whole hair care regime we have been discussing: the brushing, the oiling, the careful washing with ingredients that would not strip or damage the hair. Women were advised that improper care, excessive washing with strong soaps, exposure to the sun without a hat, the use of incorrect products, would cause the hair to fade or lose its depth of colour. This was, again, partly right and partly wrong. Sun does bleach hair. Strong soaps do alter colour slightly, but the connection between general hair health and colour richness was real enough that the advice had practical validity even when the mechanism was misunderstood. The alteration of natural colour, either to darken grey hair or to change colour more substantially, was practiced throughout the period, but was understood as a private and somewhat delicate matter. Cosmetic artifice of any kind was officially disapproved of in respectable 19th century culture, at least for most of the century. A woman who was known to dye her hair was a woman whose respectability was slightly compromised, not because hair dyeing was considered immoral exactly, but because it was considered deceptive, a manipulation of the appearance that was inconsistent with the honesty expected of a good woman. This meant that hair dyeing happened privately, at home, with ingredients that could be explained away if discovered. The home recipes for darkening grey hair were numerous. Sage tea, made from dried sage steeped in boiling water and applied regularly as a rinse, was understood to darken grey gradually through repeated use. It is mildly effective, producing a subtle shift in tone in very fair or silver hair, nothing dramatic, more of a muting of the brightness. Walnut husks, boiled in water and applied as a strong dark rinse, produced a more visible brown to dark brown colour that was genuinely effective on fair or grey hair, though it also stained the scalp and fingers the same dark brown, which could be socially inconvenient. Black tea was used as a darkening rinse. Strong coffee applied to dark brown or black hair was thought to enhance the depth of colour. Henna, which was known in Europe from its use in North Africa and the Middle East and had been imported in small quantities for centuries, became more widely available across the 19th century and was used by women who wanted to add red or auburn tones to their hair. The effect of henna on dark hair is primarily a reddish sheen in strong light. On lighter hair, it can produce a more dramatic auburn. Women who used it without knowing this sometimes got more than they bargained for. The lead acetate preparations I mentioned earlier were the more extreme end of this spectrum, used by women who wanted a reliable, dramatic darkening effect that the gentler herbal methods could not provide. They were sold commercially, and they worked, in the narrow sense, that they produced the desired colour change, and they caused harm in ways that would not be attributed to them. There is a particular irony in the fact that the women most likely to use the more dangerous preparations were often women who could afford the commercial products, women of urban middle and upper middle class who had access to druggist shops and who trusted the authority of a printed label and a professional's recommendation. The women making their own sage tea at home from garden-grown herbs, skeptical of products they didn't understand and couldn't verify, were in this respect safer. Now let me talk about something that we've touched on but deserve its own full treatment: the social ritual of hair care between women and what that meant in the 19th century. The brushing and dressing of another person's hair is one of the oldest forms of social grooming in the human world. It is intimate in a specific way, a combination of the physical and the social, a caregiving act that requires trust and produces something like closeness. In the 19th century, this intimacy between women was a significant domestic reality. In households with servants, the lady's maid was the primary figure in this arrangement. The lady's maid occupied a peculiar position in the household hierarchy, closer to her mistress than any other servant in a specific bodily way, but still a servant, still operating within a relationship of paid labour and social deference. She knew her mistress's hair in its full natural state, in the way that it looked at night unpinned, in the way that it tangled at the temples, in the way that it came out in the comb more on some days than others. She held knowledge of her mistress's body that was genuinely intimate, and she was expected to hold it without acknowledging it publicly, without letting it alter the formal distance of the employer-employee relationship. There are passages in memoirs of Victorian ladies' maids, of which only a very few survive, that describe the morning hairdressing as a kind of daily ritual that had its own particular intimacy and its own particular constraints. One maid, writing decades after the fact about her years in service in the 1870s, describes the mornings at the dressing table as the time when her mistress talked most freely, when the guards that governed social interaction were somewhat lowered, when things were said that would not have been said anywhere else in the household. The hairdressing created a private space within a not very private life, and the maid was its witness. In households without ladies' maids, this role was performed by female relatives, by mothers and daughters, by sisters, by the friend who stayed the weekend and helped with the morning arrangements. The care of another woman's hair was understood as an act of affection and service, something you did for someone you were close to, and the fact of doing it created or deepened closeness. There is a description in a letter from a woman in Maryland, writing in 1861, of spending an afternoon with her sister-in-law after both of them had washed their hair together in the kitchen, taking turns at the basin, and then sitting in the warm room together drying it, combing it out for each other, talking about their lives. She describes it as one of the pleasantest afternoons she could remember. The physical intimacy of it, the informality that wet hair represented, the shared domestic privacy, all of it created a space where conversation could happen that couldn't happen over a formal tea table or in a parlour with other people present. This kind of shared hair care between women was not just pleasurable, it was practical necessity in a world where managing very long hair without any assistance was genuinely difficult. You can wash your own hair, but you cannot easily see the back of your own head to judge whether it has been rinsed properly. You cannot easily reach all sections of your own scalp with the same thoroughness as someone doing it for you. The involvement of another person in hair washing was not a luxury in households that could not afford a maid. It was just the normal way it was done, and it involved whatever other woman was at hand. Let me tell you about the specific experience of hair in different seasons, because this is something that doesn't get discussed much, but that made a real difference to how hair care was managed across the year. In summer, the challenges were heat and sweat. The hair pinned close to the head, covered with a bonnet when outside, generated heat and dampness that accumulated at the scalp more quickly than in cooler months. The scalp might feel uncomfortably greasy within a week of the previous washing. Women who would have been comfortable stretching their hair washing to every 2 months in winter might find they needed to wash every 4 to 6 weeks in summer, not because any external standard had changed, but because the physical reality of the hair had. The summer washing also had its particular pleasures. The water could be cooler, which felt refreshing. The drying could happen outdoors, which was far faster than drying by a bedroom fire. Some women described sitting in a garden or on a back porch in the summer sun, their hair spread over their shoulders and down their back, waiting for it to dry, as one of the particular domestic pleasures of the season. It was still a private act, still managed within the domestic space, but the warmth and the light and the speed of the drying made it feel lighter than the winter version, less effortful, more pleasant. In autumn, with the cooling temperatures and the reduction in physical labour that followed the harvest, the washing could be spaced out again. Autumn was also, as we mentioned, the traditional time for certain large domestic tasks, the rendering of tallow, the production of soap and candles, the putting up of preserves. These tasks sometimes coincided with hair washing, simply because a large batch of hot water had been prepared for another purpose and could serve double duty. Winter was the hardest season for hair care. The cold slowed the drying dramatically. The drafts and the uneven heating of houses in this period meant that a woman drying her hair near a fire on one side was also being chilled on the other. The risk of getting chilled during or after washing, in an era when colds and respiratory infections could develop into genuinely dangerous conditions, was taken seriously as a real concern. Women tended to postpone winter washings and to be particularly strategic about the timing when they did wash, choosing the warmest available day, the most protected room, the time when they could be sure of remaining indoors for the rest of the day. Spring was the relief, the gradual warming of the air, the return of the possibility of drying near an open window, the willingness to attempt outdoor drying in a sheltered space. Spring washings often felt like a kind of renewal, a cleaning out and freshening that matched the larger cultural and agricultural significance of the season. There is a kind of pleasure in the idea of spring cleaning the hair, washing away the long, dark, indoor winter, returning to something that felt lighter and airier. Let me now take you to the particular world of children's hair in the 1800s. because the management of children's hair had its own distinct culture, its own distinct challenges, and its own distinct set of practices that were different from adult hair care in important ways. Children's hair in the first years of life was treated cautiously. The belief that the infant's scalp was particularly sensitive and delicate was widespread and not entirely wrong, because the scalp of a very young child is indeed more vulnerable than that of an adult. Washing of babies' heads was done minimally and with the softest possible preparation, usually just warm water with perhaps a very small amount of mild soap, worked in with the fingers and rinsed immediately and thoroughly. As children grew, the management of their hair became increasingly connected to the management of them, in the sense that children's hair was regularly checked for lice, regularly combed through with the fine-toothed comb, and regularly washed with whatever preparation was appropriate to the household's practices and resources. For girls especially, the hair was an important part of the presentation of the child to the world, and a girl whose hair was neatly braided and clean was a girl whose family was managing her properly. The braiding of girls' hair was a daily practice in most households, and it was done for reasons that were both practical and aesthetic. Braided hair stayed clean longer than hair left loose, because loose hair tangles and traps more dust and debris. Braided hair was easier to check for lice. Braided hair was also, in the aesthetic of the period, the correct presentation for a girl child, the mark of a properly managed household. The washing of children's hair was more frequent than adult hair washing, partly because children's scalps did accumulate oil and grime more quickly through the physical activity of childhood, and partly because the louse management that was part of children's hair care required more regular attention. Monthly washing for school-aged children was not unusual in middle-class urban households by mid-century. For girls approaching adolescence, the management of the hair began to shift toward the adult regime, the less frequent washing, the greater care taken with the texture and appearance, the introduction of the brush with its 100-stroke practice as a nightly ritual. The transition from girls' hair to women's hair was a literal one in the 19th century, in the sense that the pinning up of the hair, the shifting from the loose or simply braided style of childhood to the dressed-up style of womanhood, was a social marker of some significance. Girls in many middle-class households wore their hair loose or in a simple braid. Women wore theirs up. The first pinning up of a girl's hair was a small but noted milestone, a visible signal that she was crossing from one category to another, and with that crossing came the full inheritance of the adult hair care regime, the careful washing, the 100 strokes, the pomade, the pins, the whole elaborate management of the grown woman's crowning glory, as the beauty writers of the period liked to call it, with a certain reverence. I want to talk now about the specific experience of washing hair in different kinds of households, because the image we've built so far has been primarily the experience of middle-class white women in the United States and Britain, and that is only a fraction of the story. For enslaved women in the antebellum South, the management of hair was shaped by a completely different set of conditions, constraints and practices, and it has its own history of enormous richness and significance that scholars have worked to reconstruct and that deserves serious attention. The hair of African-descended women has specific characteristics in terms of coil pattern, porosity, and the kind of care that best maintains it, that were not accommodated by the mainstream beauty practices of the white culture that surrounded them. The egg and vinegar methods that worked for straight and wavy European hair textures were not necessarily the right tools for tightly coiled hair. The combs available in most white households, designed for straight hair, were painful and damaging on tightly coiled textures. The pomades that were used and recommended in the white beauty literature were not necessarily appropriate either. What enslaved women did, in conditions of coercion and deprivation, and with minimal access to resources, was develop and maintain hair care practices adapted to their own hair's needs, drawing on African traditions of hair care that had survived the Middle Passage in fragmentary form and had continued to be passed between generations within the conditions of slavery. The use of heavy butters and oils, particularly the heavy animal fats available from the plantation kitchen, applied in significant quantities and worked through tightly coiled hair to provide moisture and protection, was one such practice. The use of head wraps and coverings, which had both practical functions, protecting the hair from sun and dust and dryness, and cultural ones, was another. The practices of braiding and twisting the hair in protective styles that kept it contained and prevented excessive tangling and breakage were central, and these practices had roots in specific African cultural traditions that gave them meaning beyond their utility. The enforced uncovering of enslaved women's heads in certain contexts, the removal of the head wrap as an assertion of dominance, was experienced as a specific form of violation and humiliation, because the head wrap was not simply a practical garment. It was cultural and personal, connected to practices of beauty and dignity that the enslaved woman carried as part of herself, even in conditions designed to strip everything from her. After emancipation, the hair practices of Black American women were shaped by the complex intersections of cultural inheritance, economic circumstance, and the intense social pressure of a racist culture that derided natural black hair textures and styles and applied enormous pressure toward assimilation to white beauty standards. The late 19th century saw the development of commercial hair care products specifically marketed to black women, some created by black entrepreneurs and some created by white companies seeking to profit from the market, and the cultural politics of these products, of straightening tools and lightening creams, and the values they encoded, are an important and painful part of the history that this episode can only gesture toward. What I want to say about it here, with full awareness that it deserves far more than a gesture, is that the story of hair care in the 19th century is not one story. The brushing and the egg washing and the rosemary rinses of the white middle-class woman's dressing table existed alongside entirely different practices rooted in entirely different traditions, maintained under entirely different conditions, and the full picture requires all of those strands to be present. Let me come back to some of the specific chemistry of what the 19th century put on its hair, because there is something genuinely interesting there for people who find the science of it compelling, and I think the science of this particular history connects to the story in ways that are worth taking a little time with. The alkalinity question is one of the most important ones. Hair care is largely about managing pH. The hair shaft and scalp are naturally slightly acidic, in the range of 4 to 5 on the pH scale. Products that are more alkaline than this, which includes most soaps, will interact with the hair cuticle in ways that cause it to swell and open, disrupting the smooth surface of the hair shaft and making it more vulnerable to tangling and damage. The roughened cuticle also reflects light differently, which is why hair washed with alkaline soap looks dull compared to hair washed with a pH-balanced modern shampoo. The Victorian practice of using an acidic rinse after washing, the vinegar rinse we have discussed several times, was a practical response to this problem. The acid of the vinegar, with a pH around 2 to 3, would counteract the alkalinity of whatever had been used in the wash, restore the slightly acidic environment to which the hair cuticle was adapted, cause the cuticle to lie flat again, and thus restore the glossy surface. Women who did this consistently got visibly better results than women who did not. They observed this with their own eyes, passed the knowledge along, and the practice became standard without anyone ever having the language to explain why it worked. The egg wash was also, by chance, reasonably pH appropriate. Egg yolks have a pH of around 6, which is mildly alkaline but not dramatically so, and the proteins in the egg coat the hair shaft in a way that protects it from the effects of that mild alkalinity. The overall result was a gentler wash than soap would provide, which is why women observed that their hair felt better after egg than after soap, and stuck with the egg. The soap-based washes, when used, worked better with soft water than hard, which is why the rain barrel and the borax softener were so important. Hard water compounds react with soap to form an insoluble scum that deposits on the hair shaft rather than washing away, causing the dull, heavy feeling that hard water washed hair has. Women who noticed this and switched to rainwater were fixing a real chemical problem through practical observation without ever knowing what a calcium carbonate deposit was. There is something genuinely satisfying about how much of Victorian hair care was, underneath its cultural trappings and its sometimes wrong reasoning, actually well adapted to the real properties of hair. The 100-stroke brush, the acidic rinse, the soft water, the minimal use of alkaline soap, the heavy oiling of dry ends. These were not random practices. They were the result of generations of observation and adjustment, of doing the thing and seeing what happened, and doing it differently and seeing what happened then, a slow empirical process that arrived at effective answers without theoretical understanding. The things that went wrong, the lead dyes, the arsenic tonics, the more dramatic chemical preparations, were generally the things that came from outside this empirical tradition, from commercial interests promising dramatic results, from theories based on incorrect medical premises, from the desire for speed or certainty or transformation that the slow observational approach could not provide. It is, if you want to draw a broad lesson from it, a fairly good argument for the value of knowing your own body through long, quiet, attentive experience, and a fairly good argument for skepticism toward anyone who promises dramatic improvement from something you don't entirely understand. Let me take you now to the end of the century, to the 1890s specifically, because this is the decade in which the old practices began to give way most visibly to the new, and it is interesting to watch from a position of historical distance. By 1890, in the larger American and British cities, running water in middle-class homes was common. The bathroom as a distinct room with a fixed tub and basin was becoming standard. The physical infrastructure that had made frequent hair washing impractical, the labor of carrying and heating water, the challenge of managing the drying in inadequately warm and ventilated spaces was beginning to dissolve for the urban middle class. At the same time, the bacteriological science that Pasteur and Koch had established was filtering into popular medical consciousness, and the concept of cleanliness as health was being applied more broadly. Articles in women's magazines began to argue for more frequent washing as a matter of hygiene, framing the infrequent washing of the earlier part of the century as a quaint and slightly primitive practice of a less scientific age. The commercial shampoo preparations were improving. Coconut oil soap had been identified as particularly good for washing hair because it could produce a lather even in hard water, which regular soap could not. By the late 1880s, advertisements for coconut oil-based liquid shampoos were appearing in druggists' shops and in the back pages of ladies' magazines. The word shampoo itself was being applied to these products, carrying with it the association of the Indian head massage tradition, while being now firmly attached to a commercial cleaning product. The women who encountered these products were encountering an entirely new framework for hair care, a framework in which washing happened not 4 times a year, but monthly or fortnightly, in which the product used came from a bottle rather than from the kitchen, in which the care of the hair was becoming, in small but real ways, outsourced to manufacturers rather than managed through embodied domestic knowledge. This shift produced, among other things, a notable change in the beauty writing of the period. The elaborate home recipes that had filled the middle sections of household manuals began to give way to product recommendations, to advertisements dressed up as editorial advice, to the gradual disappearance of the recipe-based approach as commercial products made it redundant, or seemed to. There were women who resisted this shift, who continued with their egg washes and their rain barrels and their 100 strokes long after commercial shampoo was available. There were also women who embraced it enthusiastically, who found in the bottled preparation a convenience and a freedom from the complicated domestic labor of hair care that felt genuinely liberating. Both responses were rational given the circumstances and values of the individual woman. There is a letter, written in 1893 by a woman named Clara Bartlett to her sister in England, that I find particularly evocative of this transitional moment. Clara has recently visited a hairdressing establishment in Boston that offered a shampoo service, and she describes the experience with a mixture of delight and slight discomfort. She found it wonderfully pleasant to have someone else manage the water and the rinsing and the careful combing out, but also found it strange to have her head in the hands of a stranger, in a shop, in a procedure that felt to her very private being, done in a semi-public setting. She notes that the young woman who performed the treatment was both skilled and discreet, but that she, Clara, spent the duration aware of a kind of exposure she was not accustomed to. She would go again, she says. She suspects she will go quite regularly, but she wanted her sister to know that it felt different than she expected. That account, that specific discomfort with having a private ritual performed in a professional setting, is a small window into a real transition in how women experience their own hair care. The 100 years after 1893 would normalize the salon entirely, would make it the expected and standard location for hair washing of any significance. But Clara was living in the moment when that normalization was not yet complete, when the private and the professional were still in some friction around this particular act of bodily care. I want to spend a few minutes on hair loss and the hair growth industry of the 19th century, because this is one of the most revealing and, frankly, one of the most entertaining corners of the history. Hair loss has been a concern for as long as humans have been aware of it, which is to say as long as there have been humans. The 19th century, with its expanding commercial culture and its developing ability to package and market promises, was particularly fertile ground for preparations that claimed to prevent or reverse hair loss. The market was enormous, the customers were desperate, and the products ranged from harmless to comical to genuinely dangerous. The theories about what caused hair loss in this period were varied and imaginative. Tight hats were blamed, excessive brushing was blamed, insufficient brushing was blamed, the wrong diet was blamed, the use of incorrect hair preparations was blamed, excessive mental exertion was blamed, with some Victorian physicians going so far as to suggest that women who engaged in serious intellectual work were at particular risk of hair loss because the blood supply was being diverted from the scalp to the overtaxed brain. This theory was, it should be said, not supported by any evidence whatsoever, but it did have the convenient effect of suggesting that female intellectual ambition was literally physiologically dangerous, which tells you a great deal about whose interests the theory was serving. The actual most common cause of hair loss in both sexes is androgenic alopecia, genetic hair thinning driven by hormones, which is neither preventable nor reversible by any topical application. This was not understood in the 19th century. It was not understood in its full mechanism until the 20th. So the enormous variety of hair growth preparations sold to the Victorian public were all, without exception, incapable of doing the main thing they were sold to do. This did not dent the market at all, because hope is a powerful commercial engine, and the belief that the right preparation, used consistently, would restore what had been lost was more persuasive than the absence of evidence against it. The preparations themselves varied widely. At the respectable end were the pomades and tonics that contained castor oil, rosemary, and similar ingredients that, while not growing new hair, did genuinely improve the condition of the hair that remained and made it appear thicker and healthier. At the less respectable end were preparations containing various chemical compounds promoted as stimulants to the follicle, some of which had no effect, and some of which, particularly those containing heavy metals, caused additional damage to the scalp that accelerated rather than prevented hair loss. There is a wonderful advertisement from a London newspaper of the 1870s for something called Hargreaves' Miracle Hair Restorer that claims, among other things, to have restored to full growth the hair of a gentleman who had been entirely bald for 7 years. The testimony comes from the gentleman himself, identified by initials only, who describes his baldness, his discovery of the preparation, his initial skepticism, and his subsequent amazement as the hair grew back over a period of months. The advertisement goes on to explain that the preparation cannot be purchased at any druggist's establishment, but must be obtained directly from the company at a price that is, it promises, extremely reasonable given the miraculous nature of the results. This kind of advertising, the personal testimonial from an identified but not identifiable satisfied customer, the exclusive availability directly from the manufacturer, the slightly breathless tone of miracle witnessing, is essentially identical to certain categories of internet advertising today. The mechanisms of persuasion in the market for hope have changed surprisingly little in 150 years. Now let me talk about something that connects hair washing to a broader history of women's relationship to their own time and bodies in the 19th century. The question of who had the time for these rituals and what the possession or lack of that time said about a woman's place in the social order. We have touched on this already in the contrast between Margaret's Wednesday morning of careful washing and drying and Ellen's more pragmatic approach, constrained by the demands of 4 children and a farm household. But I want to push a little deeper into this question, because it connects to something that the women of this period were quite aware of, even if they didn't have the specific language for it that we now use. The elaborate hair care regime, the washing and the drying and the careful brushing and the management of pomades and powders and pins was time-consuming in a very specific way. It required not just the time of the actual tasks, but the time of uninterruptibility. You could not wash your hair in the hour before supper. You could not brush your hair in the kitchen while supervising children's dinner. These were tasks that required a room, a door, time that belonged to you rather than to the household's demand. A woman who had a lady's maid had help with these tasks, and thus had the time made available by the division of labour. A woman who had domestic servants of any kind had the household's basic tasks managed by others, which created the margin for the personal care routines that made the elaborate regime possible. A woman who had no servants, no margin, no hour that was unclaimable, managed her hair in the gaps of her life with whatever could be fit there. She was not necessarily managing it worse, but she was managing it differently, without the luxury of deliberateness that the fuller regime required. This is why, when we read descriptions of elaborate Victorian hair routines in the beauty manuals and ladies' magazines of the period, we should understand that these descriptions were written by and for a specific class of women. They were not describing universal practice. They were describing the ideal of a particular social tier and prescribing it to the readers of that tier, while being largely inapplicable to the lives of the majority of women who did not have the time or the resources the regime assumed. There is something a little bit heartbreaking in this, if you sit with it. The exhausted seamstress in a London boarding house in 1860, working 12-hour days in inadequate light, managing her hair in 5 minutes on Sunday morning before church, reading in a borrowed magazine about the 100-stroke brush routine and the rosewater rinses and the proper technique for the vinegar close, and knowing that none of it was for her life. Not because she did not deserve it, because her life had not the space for it, and yet she too had hair. It mattered to her, in its own way, constrained by its own circumstances. The fact that her hair care was minimal does not mean that she was indifferent to her hair or that it had no meaning in her life. It means that the meaning was negotiated within a much narrower set of options. I want to spend a little time now on the sensory and emotional dimensions of the hair washing experience itself, because I think these are undervalued in historical accounts, and they are the dimension that, for a late-night listening like this, might be the most resonant. What does it feel like to wash your hair in the method we have been describing? Not in a modern shower, not in the comfortable automatic way of a Tuesday morning, but in the deliberate, prepared, time-consuming way of the 19th century. The first thing is the warmth of the water. Water heated in a kettle and poured into a basin, tested with the wrist, then used to wet the hair before the washing begins. The warmth of the water is not the warm spray of a shower, which hits you from above and continues uninterrupted. It is a dipping, a leaning, a gravity-pulled contact between your head and the surface of the water, followed by the hands working through the wet hair, and the sensation of fingers on the scalp after weeks of dry management is significant. The scalp, which has been under pins and combs and constrained within a dressed hairstyle for however long, is suddenly released and touched, and the touching produces a physical response somewhere between relief and pleasure. The smell of the washing mixture is distinct from what we know, not the chemical brightness of modern shampoo, which is an acquired cultural preference for a synthetic scent, but the smell of egg and rose water, and perhaps a little brandy, and the faint green note of rosemary oil. It is a smell that is faintly culinary and faintly botanical and entirely domestic, and it is not unpleasant. It is the smell of the dressing table, the bedroom, the private space, the combing out while the hair dries, the wide-toothed comb drawn through damp hair, the small resistance of a tangle found and worked through, the gradual unmatting of the whole length as the process continues. There is something deeply satisfying about this particular physical experience that I suspect crosses the centuries in quite a direct way, because untangling a knot in hair is one of those acts that seems to satisfy some ancient orderly impulse in the human brain. The moment when the hair is dry enough to brush properly, the first full stroke of the boar-bristle brush from root to tip, the way the hair separates and aligns and begins to gleam. The room has been warm for hours, the fire is low but still present. The house is quiet in the way it is quiet on a late morning when the children are elsewhere and the household's heavy labor is done for the moment. And here is this woman, whoever she is, Margaret in Philadelphia, or Hannah in Ohio, or Ellen in Kentucky, with her hair loose and clean and drying around her, having spent her morning in this slow and particular attention to one small but significant corner of herself. There is something almost meditative about the full experience, in the way that practices requiring patience and repetition and attention without narrative can be meditative. The 100 strokes are not thinking strokes, they are feeling strokes. The body is occupied, the hands are engaged, but the mind is free to drift in the way that the mind drifts during monotonous physical tasks, neither fully engaged nor fully detached. I wonder sometimes what those women thought about, alone with their hair and their brushes, in those quiet hours. The problems of the household, the conversation they needed to have, the letter they were composing in their heads, the fears they were carrying that had nowhere to be put down, the small and specific pleasures of the morning. All of it moving through the mind in the particular freedom that the body occupied in simple, repetitive, familiar work will allow. The late 19th century was also the period when, in certain intellectual and artistic circles, there began to be a conscious appreciation and romanticization of the elaborate care routines of the past, even as those routines were beginning to change. The pre-Raphaelite painters, who were active primarily in the middle decades of the century, but whose influence persisted into the 1880s and 1890s, made the lavish, loose, cascading hair of their female subjects into a kind of aesthetic statement. Paintings like Dante Gabriel Rossetti's portraits of Jane Morris and Elizabeth Siddal, with their extraordinary masses of rippling, unpinned hair, were in part a conscious revolt against the controlled, dressed, socially legible hair of respectable Victorian womanhood. Rossetti's women have their hair down in ways that no respectable Victorian woman would have appeared in public, and the transgression was deliberate. The loose hair was wild and romantic and slightly dangerous and connected to a conception of the female that was more ancient and less socially managed than the corseted, pinned-up, calling card and drawing room version. The painters knew they were making a statement. The women who sat for them knew it too, though their own feelings about it were complex and various. Elizabeth Siddal, who was Rossetti's muse and eventually his wife, was notable for her extraordinary red hair, which appeared in painting after painting as a physical feature so distinctive as to be almost a character in itself. The reality of her actual hair care in the context of the cold, poorly heated studio where she sat for hours modeling, was rather different from the glamour of the painted version. The art romanticized the hair. The hair itself required the same ordinary attention as anyone else's. Jane Morris, similarly, was famous for her dark, extraordinary hair, and there are accounts of Rossetti's attention to it that hover uncomfortably between aesthetic obsession and something more troubling. The hair of these women was simultaneously their most visible attribute, and the thing over which they had the least control in the context of their relationships with the artists who painted them. Let me bring us toward the close of the century now, as the new approaches to hair care were becoming established, but the old ones were not yet gone, and the two existed in a kind of productive and sometimes conflicted tension. By 1895, a middle-class urban woman in London or New York or Boston might be washing her hair monthly. She might be using a commercial preparation, or she might still be using eggs, or she might be doing both at different times depending on what was available and convenient. She might have access to a hairdresser who offered a shampoo service, and might have visited it once or twice. She would still be brushing regularly, still using some form of oil or pomade for maintenance between washings, still managing the drying with patience and care. The range of products available to her had expanded enormously compared to what her mother had had. The range of advice she received, from magazines, from friends, from the growing beauty press, had expanded even more, and the overall direction of that advice was toward more frequent washing, toward more product use, toward an increasing alignment of cleanliness with respectability that would continue to accelerate through the early 20th century until it arrived at the daily washing regime most of us grew up with and still practice. The women of 1895 were the generation who bridged the old world of domestic hair care and the new world of commercial hair care. They had inherited the knowledge of how to make it at home and were simultaneously being offered the option of buying it instead. Some chose one, some the other. Most found themselves somewhere in between, as generations do when they stand at the intersection of two worlds that have not yet fully resolved into a third. Now, I want to come back to something I said at the very beginning of tonight, which is that by the end of this story, you would never look at a simple sunset the same way again. I said sunset because that is how we begin another one of our evenings together, and I realize now that the metaphor belongs not to sunsets, but to something more immediate, more domestic, more private. I want you to think about the next time you wash your hair, not in a hurrying Tuesday before work way, but in the actual texture of the experience, the warmth of the water, the smell of what you use, the feeling of your hands on your own scalp, which is the same physical sensation that every woman in this story experienced, the same nerve endings and the same scalp responding to the same kind of pressure in the same way, the combing out of wet hair, the drying, the brushing. These things have not changed in their basic sensory reality in 200 years. The product in your hand is different, the time it takes is shorter, the resources required are far fewer, the social stakes attached to the outcome are different, but the act itself, the washing of the hair, the hands on the scalp, the water and the care, is one of the continuous threads in the fabric of women's lives across all those generations. When Margaret sat in her bedroom in 1852, drying her hair by the fire with her book open in her lap, she was doing something that her great-grandmother had done and that her great-granddaughter would do, differently but recognizably. When Hannah Luttrell in Ohio wrote in her diary about spending the afternoon in her combing, she was noting something that might have seemed too small to record, but that she knew, on some level, was part of the actual texture of her life, worth noting because it happened and mattered and would happen again. The ordinary care of the body, the hair and the skin and the sleep and the eating and all the rest of it, is what most of life is actually made of. Not the grand events and the recorded speeches and the documented public moments, but the daily, repeated, quietly important acts of caring for the self and for others. The historian's job is partly to look at those acts and say, this was real, this happened, these were people, and this is what their days contained. And my job, or at least the job I have chosen for these evenings, is to look at those same acts and say, does this feel familiar? Can you feel it across the years? When you imagine Margaret by her fire with her wet hair and her patience and her book, is there something in that resonates with your own experience of damp hair and a warm room and a few slow hours that belong to you? I think there is. I think there is something in the particular domestic privacy of hair care that has stayed constant even as everything around it has changed. The closed door, the private state of the unpinned and unguarded self, the slow and somewhat intimate attention paid to this particular corner of the body. The Victorian woman who was meticulous about when she washed her hair and how and with what, and who managed it carefully through the long weeks between, was not being excessive or old-fashioned or unduly burdened by her era's peculiarities. She was doing what people have always done, which is managing the actual physical reality of being a person in the world, with the tools and knowledge and time available to her. That the tools were different, the knowledge was partly wrong and partly right, and the time was allocated in ways we would find startling. These are true things, they are interesting things, they are the things that make history worth sitting with on a quiet night. But underneath all of it is the same hands on the same hair, the same desire for the hair to be well, the same attention to the specific and irreplaceable experience of this particular body moving through this particular life. Let me slow down now, as we come toward the end of our evening together. The hour is late. You are wherever you are, in your comfortable place, in your particular version of warmth and dark and quiet. And we have spent a long time together tonight in an 1800s bedroom, at a Victorian dressing table, over a basin of warm water and a carefully measured quantity of beaten egg. We've followed the hand that held the brush through its 100 strokes. We've watched the hair dry in the winter firelight. We've read the letters and the diary entries that women left behind, the small and specific records of acts they probably never imagined anyone would find interesting enough to read. There is something I want to say before we part for tonight, and it is something I find difficult to articulate precisely, but feel quite strongly when I have spent a long time with this particular history. The women of the 19th century were remarkable managers of their own physicality, in conditions that did not make management easy. The hair care routines they maintained, the knowledge they accumulated and transmitted, the practical intelligence they applied to the problem of keeping themselves well and presentable and dignified within the constraints of their era, all of it represents a form of competence and care that I think deserves more recognition than it usually receives. We tend to historicize these things in a way that makes them seem charming or quaint, rather than genuinely impressive. We see the Victorian dressing table in a museum display case, the ivory brush and the pomade jar and the hair receiver, and we appreciate the aesthetics of it, without fully registering that someone used that brush every night for 20 years, with great seriousness and real skill. The women who passed these practices on to their daughters, who taught the vinegar rinse and the right temperature for the egg wash and the proper motion of the comb through wet hair, were doing what every generation has done, transmitting the embodied knowledge that makes it possible to live well in a body in the world. The specific knowledge changes, the practice of transmitting it is continuous, and the hair is continuous, in a way that I find quietly moving when I think about it. The hair of the women in this story is gone now, folded into the earth, or kept in small glass-fronted lockets in museum collections, or lost entirely, but the hair on your own head, wherever you are tonight, is the heir of all that careful attention. Every woman who washed her hair in rainwater and rinsed it with vinegar and worked the oil through the lengths and braided it for bed was, in her own way, demonstrating something about the value of giving sustained attention to the small and daily and irreplaceable things. Your hair matters, not because it signals your character or demonstrates your respectability or places you correctly in the social order, none of which, thankfully, is how things work anymore. It matters because it is yours and you live in it, and the care of it is one of the oldest and quietest forms of paying attention to yourself that exists. When you wash it next, just for a moment, let it be slow, let the water be warm, let your hands be present on your scalp. Notice the smell of what you're using. Notice the way the wet hair feels different from the dry hair, heavier, more vulnerable, temporarily without its usual structure. Think, if you want to, of Margaret by her fire, of Hannah in Ohio with her wide-toothed comb, of Ellen with her vinegar rinse and her good practical knowledge, of all the women whose hair care was too ordinary to record and thus survives only in the faint impression it made on the world around them. They washed it, and they waited for it to dry, and they pinned it up, and the day went on, and the day goes on. The lamp is very low now. The fire, if there were a fire, would have settled to something slow and amber and patient. The hair, wherever yours is at this moment, is doing whatever it does at this hour, which is rest. The hair of a 19th century woman was not simply hair. That is the thing I kept coming back to while I was sitting with all of this. It was time, and time in that century was never truly a woman's own. It was labour, the kind that left no mark and received no credit. It was social standing, compressed into a single visual signal that every person she encountered would read and interpret in about 3 seconds. It was identity, in the way that certain physical things carry meaning so deep it stops being about the physical at all. So, let us go back. Let us go back to somewhere around 1850, give or take a decade in either direction, and spend some time in a room most history books never bother to enter, a woman's bedroom, early morning, before the household is fully woken, before the day has made its demands. The water is cold. The fire, if there is one, is just beginning to catch. And there is a woman sitting at her dressing table who has decided that today is wash day, not laundry wash day, hair wash day. And the first thing you need to understand is how rarely that day came. We wash our hair now with a thoughtlessness that would have been genuinely foreign to most women living 150 years ago. We step into the shower, we reach for the bottle, we spend 45 seconds lathering, we rinse, we maybe condition, and the whole business is over before we have fully woken up. The average American today washes their hair somewhere between 2 and 5 times a week. Some people do it daily. The product is cheap, the water is hot. The whole infrastructure of modern hair washing is so seamlessly built into daily life that we never think about it at all. In the 1800s, most women washed their hair roughly once a month. Some stretched it to 6 weeks, some went longer, and this was not because they were careless or unhygienic, or less evolved than we are. It was because washing hair in that century was a substantial undertaking that required significant preparation, considerable physical effort, a full day set aside for drying, and a willingness to be temporarily, conspicuously, vulnerably undone in a way that the social codes of the era made genuinely complicated. Let me walk you through what it actually looked like, not in the abstract, but specifically, step by step, the way it would have unfolded in a real house with real water and real hands. The preparation had to start the night before, or at least several hours before, because the first problem was temperature. There was no hot running water. There was no tap you could adjust. If you wanted warm water, and you did want warm water, because washing long thick hair in cold water was a particular kind of misery, you had to heat it yourself. That meant filling a large kettle or pot, hauling it to the fire or stove, waiting for it to heat, then carrying it carefully to wherever you planned to do the washing without burning yourself or sloshing it across the floor, then mixing it in a basin with cold water until you had reached something close to comfortable, and doing all of this while the household around you was either still sleeping or already making demands of you that had nothing to do with your hair. For women with household staff, some of this labor could be delegated. A maid might carry the hot water, might help with the actual washing, might hold towels and hand over whatever mixture was being used as shampoo. But even in relatively prosperous households, hair washing was still a production, still something that required planning and coordination and the deliberate carving out of time. And for the vast majority of women who had no staff at all, who were managing a household entirely alone or with minimal help, the whole thing landed squarely on their own shoulders, literally. The bending over the basin, the hauling of the water, the wringing of the hair afterward, all of it physical, all of it effortful, all of it invisible in the accounting of what women's days contained. Now, what did they actually wash with? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the answer changed significantly across the century, and the range of what was used is wider and stranger and more inventive than you might expect. The concept of commercial shampoo as we understand it did not exist for most of the 1800s. The word shampoo itself came into English from the Hindi champo, meaning to press or massage, and referred originally to a kind of head massage that British colonists encountered in India. Early uses of the word described a scalp treatment, not a cleansing product. The liquid in a bottle that we reach for automatically, the thing we have a dozen varieties of, sorted by hair type and scent and what it promises to do. That did not arrive until very late in the century, and even then it was not widely available or affordable for ordinary households. What women used instead was a combination of things, some passed down through household recipe books, some recommended in the beauty columns of ladies' magazines, some simply inherited from mothers and grandmothers who had learnt them from theirs. Eggs were one of the most common. Raw eggs, beaten and worked through the hair and scalp, left to sit for a few minutes, then rinsed out. The protein in the egg white helped to clean without stripping, and the yolk added something that women noticed even if they could not have named it scientifically, a softness, a kind of smoothing quality that the hair responded to. Egg washing was particularly popular in the middle of the century, and appears in household manuals and beauty guides of the period, with a regularity that suggests it was genuinely widespread rather than a niche practice. Rum was another. Not drinking rum specifically, but rum applied to the scalp in small amounts, either alone or mixed with other things, as a kind of tonic that was believed to stimulate circulation and keep the hair vigorous. Whether it actually did what it was supposed to do is another question. But the smell of rum in a woman's hair was considered, in certain circles, a mark of careful grooming rather than anything scandalous. The alcohol served a practical purpose as well, cutting through oil in a way that plain water could not. Rosemary water, made by steeping the herb in hot water and allowing it to cool, was used widely, both for washing and as a final rinse. Rosemary had been associated with hair health in European tradition for centuries. It smelled clean and herbal and pleasant. Whether it genuinely encouraged growth or prevented loss, as some manuals claimed, is debatable. But as a rinse that left the hair smelling good and feeling slightly refreshed, it had a certain undeniable logic. Vinegar rinses were common too, particularly apple cider vinegar diluted with water. The mild acidity helped to seal the hair and remove soap residue, which was a real problem because when soap was used, and plain soap did often feature in hair washing, it left a residue that could make the hair dull and slightly sticky. A vinegar rinse addressed that. Women who used it regularly tended to find their hair shinier and easier to manage, which is why the practice survived long enough to be rediscovered as a beauty tip in the 21st century. Beer, particularly flat stale beer, was applied to the hair by some women as a setting agent, helping elaborate styles hold their shape. It is mentioned in beauty manuals of the period with a nonchalance that suggests it was perfectly ordinary, which it apparently was. And then there was Macassar oil. Macassar oil deserves its own moment because it became so ubiquitous in the first half of the 19th century that it generated its own domestic problem, and that domestic problem generated its own domestic solution, and the whole chain of events says something genuinely funny and very human about how culture works. Macassar oil was a hair preparation made primarily from coconut oil and ylang-ylang, named after a region in what is now Indonesia, though most commercial versions sold in England and America bore only the loosest relationship to any actual ingredient from Macassar. It was used almost universally by men to slick and control their hair, and quite commonly by women to add shine and moisture to theirs. It smelled pleasant, it worked reasonably well, and it was fashionable. The problem was that it stained upholstered furniture. A man or woman who had oiled their hair and then leaned back in a chair left a grease mark on the fabric that was genuinely difficult to remove, so the antimacassar was invented, the small decorative cloth draped over the back of chairs and sofas to protect them from oiled hair. The word is still in use, though most people who say it have no idea what it originally referred to. They think of antimacassars as purely decorative, a quaint Victorian affectation, and they are at this point. But they started as a practical solution to the very real problem of everyone in a household walking around with oiled hair and sitting on expensive furniture. The whole thing makes me smile, the way these little chains of cause and effect run through domestic history. Someone wanted shiny hair, so they used oil. The oil stained the chairs. Someone sewed small cloths to protect the chairs. The cloths became decorative. Generations passed, and now the original reason is entirely forgotten, and we just think our great-grandmothers had a thing for crocheted chair covers. But let us get back to wash day itself, because the washing was only the beginning of the ordeal. The larger challenge, the one that shaped the whole experience and determined how often it was actually feasible to wash at all, was drying. Long hair takes an enormous amount of time to dry without heat. A woman in the 1800s with hair that reached her waist, which was not uncommon and was in fact the fashionable ideal for much of the century, was working with something like 3 or 4 times the surface area of hair that a woman with shoulder-length hair would have. Without a blow dryer, without any of the heated tools we use to speed the process, the drying happened entirely through exposure to warm air, either near a fire or in a well-lit room, or, when weather permitted and privacy could be managed, outdoors in sunshine. And this drying time was not a small inconvenience, it was a full-day commitment. Hair this long and this thick, once thoroughly wetted, could take 6, 8, 10 hours to dry completely. Some women reported that their hair was still slightly damp at the roots by bedtime, even having started in the morning. Going out in public with wet or damp hair was not really an option, both because the social expectations around appearance were strict and because the practical consequences were real. Catching cold from going out with wet hair was a genuinely held belief in the 19th century, not dismissed as old wives' wisdom the way we might dismiss it now, but taken as a practical medical fact that shaped behavior accordingly. So wash day meant staying in. It meant a day largely confined to the house, which for many women who were already largely confined to the house was not necessarily a dramatic sacrifice, but it did mean a day of being in a particular state of undress, of exposure, of being caught between the washed and unwashed version of yourself, the hair down and drying, which was private, the hair up and arranged, which was public. That distinction between hair down and hair up mattered enormously in the 19th century in ways that go well beyond the practical question of whether your hair was dry yet. Hair down was for the bedroom, for illness, for the intimacy of close family, for the moments of the day before and after you had assembled yourself for the world. A woman with her hair loose and falling freely around her shoulders was, in the visual language of the era, not quite public yet. She was in a state of becoming, not yet herself in the social sense, and this meant that the long hours of wash day, with the hair loose and drying, were genuinely private hours in a way that the rest of a woman's day often was not. There is something I find tender about this when I sit with it. The idea that the one time in the month when your hair was completely down and free and you were just waiting for it to dry, that was also one of the only times you had a legitimate reason to be slow, to sit near the fire and let the warmth do its work, to not be performing anything for anyone. The hair had to dry, you simply had to wait, and waiting, in a century that measured a woman's worth substantially by her productivity and her management of the household, was not something you got to do very often. Some women used the drying hours for needlework, which could be done sitting still. Some wrote letters, some read, which the etiquette of the era suggested should be done in moderation, but which plenty of women did when they could manage it. Some simply sat and thought, which was the most transgressive option of all, and the one least likely to appear in any written record. The tools of hair maintenance in the 1800s are worth spending a moment with, because the collection that sat on a woman's dressing table was more deliberate and more curated than we tend to imagine. A fine comb, ideally ivory or bone, with closely spaced teeth on one side and wider teeth on the other. A brush with natural boar-bristle, because the keratin in boar-bristle is close enough to the structure of human hair that it distributes the scalp's natural oil effectively without causing the kind of breakage that harsher bristles create. A smaller comb for parting, pins of various sizes, small pots and jars containing various preparations. The brush in particular was important. We talked in an earlier part of this evening about the Victorian tradition of 100 strokes nightly, and all of that applies here too. But on wash day the brushing served a slightly different purpose. It was part of the cleaning process. Before wetting the hair at all, a thorough brushing removed the accumulated dust and any loose debris. After washing and during drying, careful combing with a wide-toothed comb prevented the kind of tangling that long wet hair is powerfully inclined toward. And once the hair was mostly dry, another round of gentle brushing encouraged the remaining moisture to distribute evenly and the natural oils to begin working again from the scalp outward. Subscribe if you haven't already. There are more evenings like this one ahead, more ordinary lives and quiet rooms and forgotten corners of history waiting to be visited. Sleepy Old World will be here when you need it. Rest well. The morning is a long way off, and the dark is very gentle tonight.